Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, bagpipe, harp, and every kind of music to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them.
What were those instruments again? Just kidding. This is really a great story. One of my favorite stories, actually. And I think it's a good story for just a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a good story because you see the bravery of these three boys. I mean, these three boys, they are the definition of stating truth to power, because they are standing in front of the guy who has power over their lives, essentially. They're standing in front of the leader of this mighty nation, and they're saying, no, we're not going to do what you say. So it shows the bravery of these three boys, but also this story shows us the power of our God. It shows us that God is able to save, and God is not only able to save, but that God is willing to save. And another reason, the book of Daniel is one of my favorite books, but another reason why this story is one of my favorite stories is because this story shows us what people who follow God, or how people who follow God should look like, what they should look like and how they should live. And that seems like a point in the book of Daniel as a whole. Daniel is sort of a weird book whenever you look at the history of its characters, because if you just read and look at the three boys and their story, and you look at Daniel in his story, they kind of seem perfect. If you notice, whenever you read through Daniel, these boys, they never make any mistakes. Daniel never makes any mistakes. They never falter. They don't sin. They don't stumble. That's really strange. That's different from other biblical books. I mean, you look at Abraham. Abraham made some mistakes. Isaac made mistakes. Jacob made mistakes. King David, called a man after God's own heart, he made mistakes. The apostles made mistakes. And the list could go on. But these boys, it seems like they didn't make any mistakes. And why is that? Well, it's not because they were just perfect. It's not because they lived a sinless life. They were human like the rest of it. The idea here is that just wasn't the purpose of the book. When the Holy Spirit set out to write Daniel, that wasn't his purpose. His purpose wasn't to show us all the mistakes they made. Rather, I think the purpose is to show us, at least partly, how followers of God should live their lives. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about in this lesson. This lesson's titled The King's Sermon. That's what I've titled it, The King's Sermon. And most people, whenever I say that, they think I'm talking about Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount. There is a lot to learn from Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, but that's not what I'm talking about. In this context, in Daniel chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar gives a sermon after he sees this miraculous event where God saves the boys. He gives this sermon that teaches us essentially how God's people should live. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to look at King Nebuchadnezzar's sermon in Daniel chapter 3, and it's found in verse 28. And my points are essentially going to be the points that he makes in his sermon, and that's how we're going to learn what discipleship looks like. That's how we're going to learn how followers of God should live their lives. So let's jump into the lesson. What does King Nebuchadnezzar say? What does discipleship look like? Let's look at Daniel chapter 3 and verse 28. It says, "And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him." Well, that's number one. What does discipleship look like? Well, we've got to trust in God. That's what these boys did. They put their trust in God. And King Nebuchadnezzar, he's really amazed at the trust of these boys. But who wouldn't be? I mean, they showed amazing trust in God, even though they had reason to doubt God. Let me give you an example of why I say they had reason to doubt God. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is sort of setting the backdrop of what happens here in this book. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and to the place in the treasury of his God." Down in verse 6, or in verse 5, "The king assigned them a daily portion of food, and that the king ate, and the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of time they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah." Well, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there. And we see here that these boys have reason to doubt God. This God allowed them to be taken into captivity. You know, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, they took the boys from a home that they knew, from a people that they knew, and took them to a land that they did not know, to a people that they did not know. And God allowed it to happen. See, this was a God who they had probably been told stories about. This was the God who they had heard parted the sea and led his people by the hand out of Egypt. This was the God who darkened the earth. This was the God who led them into the land of Canaan, where they took the land even though they weren't as mighty as the people. Well, that God who did all of those great things had seemingly forgot about them. But they still trusted in him. We see this in Daniel chapter 3, what Hunter read in verse 17. Verse 17, it says, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." See, these boys trusted in God. And their trust is really put in contrast with King Nebuchadnezzar's trust. Because rather than trusting in God, King Nebuchadnezzar seemed to trust in himself. We see this whenever we put Daniel chapter 3 in its wider context. If we back up and look at Daniel chapter 2, in this context, in Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he has a dream about this statue with sort of different portions, the head of gold, the chest of silver, the thigh of bronze, the legs of iron, and the feet of iron and clay. He has a dream of this statue, and Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really know what to do with this dream. So Daniel has to interpret it for him. Picking up here in verse 36, this is where Daniel responds. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 36. "This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and to whose hands he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beast of the field, and the beast of heavens, making you rule over them, you are the head of gold." So what Daniel tells the king here is, you're the head of gold. God has given this kingdom to you. You rule over all of the beast, all of man, and you are the head of gold. But Daniel says in verse 39, "Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron," and so on and so forth. So Daniel essentially tells King Nebuchadnezzar, he says, look, you have this gold kingdom, and it's nice, and you rule over the earth, but your kingdom is not going to last forever. There's going to be another kingdom after you, and then another kingdom after that kingdom, and another kingdom after that kingdom. Well, what did Nebuchadnezzar think of that? What did Nebuchadnezzar think of God saying that his kingdom would come to an end? Well, I think the answer is in Daniel chapter 3. What did King Nebuchadnezzar do in response to God telling him that his gold kingdom would come to an end? Well, he built a statue, didn't he? And what was that statue made out of? It was made out of gold. Was it made out partially out of gold, or was it entirely out of gold? Entirely out of gold. I think that's King Nebuchadnezzar's response to God. I don't know that for sure, but I think within the context it's pretty evident that that's King Nebuchadnezzar's response. God says, your gold kingdom is going to come to an end. King Nebuchadnezzar says, no, it's not. See, King Nebuchadnezzar, he trusted in himself rather than trusting in what God says. And we see this throughout Daniel. We see it in Daniel chapter 4 also, where Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar, look, if you don't put your pride away, God's going to drive you away from your kingdom. And King Nebuchadnezzar did not listen. So God drove him away from the kingdom. See, King Nebuchadnezzar trusted in himself rather than trusting in God. Well, this is an important lesson for us. We cannot be like King Nebuchadnezzar. We've got to be like these three boys. We've got to make sure that we trust in our God. And we've got to make sure we trust in our God even when things don't go our way. You know, when these boys were facing that fiery furnace, I'm sure things were not how they wanted them to be. And that's probably not the situation you want to be in, facing the furnace. And they might not have known exactly what God was doing or why God was doing it. But they still trusted him. Well, there will be times where we don't know what God is doing. We don't know why God is putting us in this situation. We need to make sure that we trust in God anyway. As followers of him, we need to make sure that we put our trust in him. And that's one of the lessons that King Nebuchadnezzar teaches us. But that's not the only lesson. Let's go back to chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 28 again. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, who, number one, who trusted in him, and number two, who set aside the king's command." The New American Version says they violated the king's command. And that's exactly what they did. Hunter read it. They did not listen to the king. As a matter of fact, people came and they complained to the king, "There are these three boys who aren't listening to what you had to say." Let me just say, that couldn't have been an easy decision for them. They had every reason to believe that God had just abandoned them in Babylon. It would have been easy for them, as I said earlier, to just forget about God and to obey King Nebuchadnezzar. But that's not what they do. And the interesting thing is, in this context, King Nebuchadnezzar gives them a second chance. Let's read that here, verse 13 of chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar actually gives them a second chance. It says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that the three boys be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, 'Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready,'" I believe King Nebuchadnezzar liked these boys. I believe that he didn't want them to go into the furnace. He sort of gives them some time. He gives them a second chance, number one. But he gives them some time. Whenever you're ready, take your time. Whenever you're ready, verse 15, "When you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, fall down and worship the image that I have made. But if you do not worship, you'll be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." See, these boys had a second chance, but they still didn't listen to the king. And there were probably other voices talking to them. It probably wasn't just the king. They might have had friends who said, "You guys might want to listen to King Nebuchadnezzar. He killed some people the other day. Y'all might want to listen to him." There were probably voices talking to them because everyone else was doing it. It seemed like everyone else was bowing before this statue and worshiping the king's gods. But they didn't. They didn't listen to the king's voice. They didn't listen to the voices around them. We need to learn from these boys' example, because there are going to be times where we, like these three boys, have voices in our ears where the world will tell us one thing, but God expects something else. We've got to make sure we listen to God, and we're not listening to the rest of the world. The world will tell us, for you parents out there, let boys be boys. Let your girls be girls. Let them just do their own thing and make their own mistakes. Don't be so strict. Don't worry about the standards. I've heard people say that. That's not what Scripture says, does it? What does Ephesians 6 teach us? We have to bring up our children, y'all's children. I don't have kids. Y'all's children. Bring them up. What does Deuteronomy say? Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy says, got to be teaching our kids daily. The world tells us one thing. We got to make sure we listen to what God says. The world tells us that be selfish. Don't worry about treasures in heaven. Worry about your treasures here on earth. That's not what the Scripture says, does it? Scripture says we have to lay up treasures in heaven, and that should be our focus. The world wants us to conform to sort of their viewpoint, but Romans tells us do not be conformed to the world. There are going to be a lot of voices in our ears. But just like these three boys, we need to violate the command of the king. We can't listen to the voices around us. Our primary focus needs to be listening to God and what he says. It's not all the king says, though. Let's go back to verse 28. One more point for you. Verse 28, "Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, 'Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angels and delivered his servants, who, number one, trusted in him. Number two, set aside the king's command. And number three, yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God.'" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they yielded their bodies. They understood that their decision to follow God could potentially cost them their lives. We can read that, picking up in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." See, these boys understand that their decision could cost them their life. We see that in verse 18. He says, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that we have set up. You see, these boys tell King Nebuchadnezzar, look, our God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't deliver us, even if we die here, we're not going to serve that image that you set up. Man, how are they able to say that? I believe that they're able to say that because these boys understand something that we all need to understand. They understand that whether it's life or death, God will ultimately deliver us. So even if God doesn't deliver us here, even if God doesn't deliver us from every physical bump in the road that we go through on this side of life, if we're faithful to him, ultimately, he will deliver us. They understood that, so they yielded their body. Well, we've got to do the same. We have to be the type of people who are willing to yield our bodies. This is what Luke 17 talks a little bit about. I'm going to go there here quickly. This is where Jesus uses that line, remember Lot's wife. Luke 17, down in verse 32, Jesus says, remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. We talked about this in a previous lesson, but the idea behind this is if we are striving so hard to keep our lives the way we want it, and not willing to give up our lives for the Lord, then we're going to lose everything. But if we are willing to lose our lives for the Lord, to give up our entire being to him, then we will gain life. That's the idea. You know, the rich young ruler didn't quite understand this. We're going to go the rich young ruler. We're going to go to the Mark's account of this, Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10 and verse 17, and you guys know the story. There's this good young man, wealthy man, who it seemed like he loved the Lord. It seemed like he was doing everything right. But picking up here in Mark chapter 10 and verse 21, it says, and Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, you lack one thing. Go and sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Disheartened by the saying, this young man went away sorrowful, for he had great possession. See, this young man, this rich young ruler, he refused to yield up his body. He refused to give up his way of life to serve God. And we got to make sure that we're not that way. But I fear, living in America, that's the way we are sometimes. You know, we live in this culture where I see it, I like it, I want it, and I got it. That's the culture that we live in, where we sometimes put the next new thing before our faith in God. We put the next new thing before our walk with Christ. We need to make sure that our spiritual needs come before our physical desires. And I fear that the blessings that we have in our country can blind us to our spiritual needs. We spend so much time on our new phones, driving our new cars, riding in our new boats, that we forget that our lives belong to Christ. Now, this is what Jesus is trying to remind the church in Revelation chapter 2. Be faithful, even if it means dying, and you will receive the crown of life. See, Jesus reminds this early church that they must be willing to give their lives for him, whether that's giving your life actually or giving over your life in sort of a more philosophical sense. They both work. We've got to be willing to give our lives for the Lord. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar is exactly right. Followers of God, well, they've got to trust in God. They've got to violate the command. They can't listen to all what's going on in the world around them. And they've got to be willing to give up their life for the Lord. You know, these three boys, they understood that. They understood that, and there was fire in front of them. There was punishment in front of these three boys. But since they understood what it means to be a follower of God, God saved them from that punishment. Well, there's fire in front of us, too. There's a judgment coming, a punishment coming in front of us. Well, we've got to understand what it truly means to be a follower of God if we're going to be saved from that punishment. Maybe there's someone here today who wants that. They want to be a follower of God so that they could live with God for eternity, and so that God will save them from the fire that is to come. Well, if that's what you want, we can help you out with that this morning. Maybe there's someone else who's left the Lord. Maybe they've been listening to all the voices of the world, and you want to come back to him. Well, we'd love to help you with that also. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.